This is Antic, the Atari 8-Bit podcast. I'm Kay Savitz. Peter Hirshberg was curator of the communications wing of the Capitol Children's Museum in the early 1980s, where he helped build the Future Center, the computer lab outfitted with Atari 800 computers, and museum exhibits, some of which were computer-controlled. This interview took place on April 12, 2021. In it, we discuss Ann Lewin-Benham, director of the museum, and Guy Nouri from the Superboots lab, both of whom I have previously interviewed. Before we start, can you tell me about that beautiful reel-to-reel deck behind you?
Oh yeah, so this is that's an old TIAC, and you know what I found the other day was when we did the communications exhibit, we did a bunch of audio. There's a whole story behind that. We did a digital audio distribution system that the National Air and Space Museum gave us. So I found some of the original stuff. I have that reel to reel because I started getting into audio production and actually had an illegal radio station in my bedroom when I was in high school. So there are tapes back there that go 50 years, right? So that's a way of keeping up with stuff that can be 50 years old. And then if you take a close look here, you'll see there's a patch bay to wire everything, a couple of monitors. So yeah, it's kind of like a especially during COVID, we need production studios at home.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and you need the finest in analog 4-track technology, right?
There you go. Also, for fun today, here we have the original communications thing we raised money from for the exhibit, and here is the Superboots software business plan.
Oh, neat. Okay, I need a scan of that, sir. Please.
Yeah.
Can we? Do you have a scanner? Can we scan that?
Yeah, now of course, the Superboots business plan is like 150 pages, but yeah, I'll figure it out. What happened was, I think Ann told you the story that she was all upset when I left because I went to business school.
Yeah.
And when I was at business school, you have to write a business plan for something. So I wrote two when I was in business school. One was for Superboots because I was familiar with it. And the other, my marketing professor said, there's this crazy guy in DC who's trying to use some failed computers to make an online service. His name is Steve Case. Could you go down and give him a hand?
Uh-huh.
So those are the two business plans.
So your title, I believe, was director of the computer center. Is that
no?
Correct?
I was actually, I think, curator of the communications wing. So one of my responsibilities was to build the computer center. My broader responsibility was so Ann was the executive director of the museum, right? Mm-hmm. And then we decided to go build this communications wing. So I was in charge of the communications wing. So there were three portions of that, really. One was the research. What's the program statement? What do we want to do? What should the exhibits be? The second was, once you kind of had an idea of that, how do you actually manage the design and the development? So that was kind of like product development stuff. There were software teams that had to write software. We had to fabricate exhibits. You had to test these with kids so that they wouldn't break. So there was that whole kind of build and execute. And kind of the third part was a fair amount of fundraising. Like we had to convince people that this made sense. So it was really a lot of research and storytelling with smart people, figuring out who was going to build the stuff on time and how we we're going to go raise money. That was a really fun first job out of college.
Nice. All right. So yeah, I want to start before the beginning, before you got that job. Tell me how you got there. Tell me about education, how you learned about computers, and we'll go from there.
If we go way back to like, where did I get stuck with technology? When I was about 5 or 6 in Chicago in the early 60s, my mom was an assistant director at the public TV station in Chicago. And I used to sit on her lap as she would call a children's TV show. So now sitting in a control room, watching all of that equipment and watching a show come together, this was mesmerizing. And then, since it's a children's show, occasionally they would run out of children for the show. And then they put me on. And this was traumatic because I didn't realize it at the time, but I was up against child actors that were hams. And like, I was very shy. And so I somehow reacted to that by getting an interest in being not shy, getting interest for broadcasting, and getting an interest in technology. So this led to me eventually when I was in high school, with an illegal radio station in my bedroom. Now we're talking in the 70s. In the 70s, we didn't have home computers, but you could hack the phone system. So I was, part of this original cohort of phone freak types. We would build black boxes. I wasn't sophisticated enough to build a blue box, but I got a hold of a friend who did, and I had an audio tape, and I could just cut together and hack the phone system that way. When I was in high school, we had an IBM 1130 mainframe. So program in Fortran, use punch cards, a batch processing. But I was very early on, beginning to learn to program, and I would have fun with that. For example, we had to build some simple program that played with a y equals mx plus b function. So I took my monthly phone bill, deconstructed it, and then put it back together again, but printed out on bigger paper, but the bill was less. And I would take it to the phone company and you're wrong. My computation says the bill's too high. But since I had bigger pieces of paper than they had, it was like, they kind of believed me, because like who else would show up with. So I was kind of like, messing with computing early on. When I went to college, I went to Dartmouth, and Dartmouth in the 70s was very progressive in that it was one of the first schools that thought that every student should have access to a computer, which meant time sharing, because that's how you did computing then. And in fact, BASIC was written at Dartmouth, and they implemented it in a GE time sharing system. Even more important, it turns out these were all network computers that talked to each other. So I was sitting there in 1972 in a network computer environment, and you know what happens then. It changes the nature of communications. Somebody one year wrote a hack called XYZ, which basically turned it into chat. It's what we know as instant messenger, right? And this was transformative, because up until that moment, you would sit there and doing word processing or do your problem. And after that moment, everybody was chatting and picking up at each other and, snooping. And it was, like Facebook is today. And that was just an organic hack that came out. I had a summer internship one year. It was actually the summer by 76 that New York City was going broke. That was Ford to City Drop Dead year. And I was working for the New York City Office of Motion Picture and Television. We were trying to get motion pictures to come to New York. And we had all these permits, stacks and stacks of, all sorts of data in file cabinets. And I'm like, why don't we put these committees to a computer? We can run reports on them. We can negotiate with unions better. And they're like, okay, that sounds fine. So I called up two IT guys from the city, and I said, I'd like you to computerize this. And they came and looked at me, and they go, you're not the commissioner. You're just a damn 20-year-old intern. But they fled. It's like, we're not. So I went back to Dartmouth, and I wrote that program myself. It won second prize in the college-wide computing contest. But first prize was XYZ, that chat program that we discussed. And I said to the dean of computing, and the dean said to me, Pete, if I wasn't on the sabbatical last month, you would have won first prize. And I'm like, Dean, that chat program was written in assembly. I have no idea how they did it. That's the best thing ever. It's clearly the best. He said, no, Peter, you don't understand. Computers are for computing. We can't waste them on communications. And this light bulb went off that, of course, this was the real use of computers. So it's like after that, and having spent college in a network computing environment, and also taking classes with Dennis and Dana Meadows that were early leaders of dynamic modeling and Dynamo and systems dynamics, that I just kind of was steeped in this, even though I was not a computer science major. And then was actually in DC doing some work with some people who come out of the Carter administrations, doing kind of communications consulting work for the Agency for National Development on satellites. And Roy Mason, who Ann mentioned to you, Roy was an architect and part of the World Future Society, and another guy named Wes Thomas, who was doing PR for The Source, a very early information service, and had this crazy idea that we would solve the Iranian hostage rescue mission if only everybody had access to online services. There's a continuing theme here that we are overly optimistic about the power of technology. Mm-hmm. In any event, through these people, I met Ann. And Ann's problem was she wanted to build this ambitious communications wing and couldn't afford anybody. And I happened to understand computing, was kind of into communications. I'd read Marshall McLuhan, knew a lot of the theory stuff through another guy who had been a mentor of mine, and like building things. So she's like, why don't you come run this? So what then commenced with the Children's Museum, we had this crazy idea. And so we took almost a year to come up with what the idea was. And that's the year that we would fly out to the West Coast and hang out with Alan Kay over at Xerox PARC, or go meet Frank Oppenheimer, who had founded the Exploratorium, Robert Oppenheimer's brother, which was, as good a hands-on institution there was. Or we went to the Oregon Science Center. And for me, even though I had graduated from Dartmouth, spending all of this time, we went to MIT and met with Seymour Papert. This was a graduate school in essentially what would emerge as kind of interactive and educational and real-time computing, because we were meeting everybody. I think we showed up and met Adele Goldberg and Alan Kay probably around the same time that Larry Tesler tried to keep Steve Jobs from showing up, and essentially ripping it off and creating the Macintosh. So it now turns out to have been very early. So that's kind of how we got into it. And in the course of all of that, we then put together this program statement in which, the concept for this exhibit was, let's take people from cave times through satellites and computing. Remember, it's 81. So cable TV is taking off. We see that there's a wired future. We see fiber optics and such coming down. Personal computing exists in 81. Apple's been around for a few years. I think that's right around the time the IBM PC comes out, but it's not yet popular, which is the reason that it gave us the opportunity to build Future Center, because there was that moment, as Ann points out, there's like 3 years when everybody wanted to have access to computers and nobody had one. Okay, so what we really were doing is we were doing a show on digital convergence, which we had thought was already happening or had happened. Turns out in 83 it was just beginning. And so that was the intent of the show. We, as Ann pointed out, we literally started the show with cave times, because we talked to John Pfeiffer, who was a Princeton anthropologist. And his theory was that in the Upper Paleolithic era, 30,000 years ago, there was this creativity explosion. That was the moment that mankind started with symbols and cave paintings, and we were communicating. Like, that's when we grew. And we wanted to show that. And we showed that by essentially bringing one of his students in, who was also an artist, and recreating this sinewy cave. And in order to give you this cave experience, we wanted to turn it into a sound and light show, one of those Son and Lumières that you go to Paris or Rome to see, but we had no budget. So what we did was we wrote a script, and we knew we wanted to make all the lights go up and down in sync to the sound. To pull this off, on the back end, we had a Z100 computer. These were, I think, CPM rack mount computers. And we had those talking to solid state devices that would raise and lower the lights. So the back end was basically commands and control the lights and the audio. The front end, where you could actually program this and assign things, we wrote that in an Atari 800, and it was a high school student in DC. So I had this problem. Of course, nobody had the internet, so I actually had to bring the high school student in, and this was a professor from the University of Virginia who had to drive up. And so there was only a short period of time, like after school until too late at night, that these kids could work. And I was constantly calling up the kid's mother saying, you have to let him stay till 2 a.m. because we got to get this program done. So we actually got this audacious, easy to use front end to talk to this stupid back end. And that's how we created the cave experience. Another really interesting technology thing is, okay, so we had there was like a 15,000 square foot.
Who was this kid, and how did you find him? And
yeah, he was, I forget his first name, but he was Judith Martin's son. Judith Martin was a Washington Post a columnist. I think she wrote about food and society. Now, because we had Future Center and we were the Children's Museum, if you were a geek kid who wanted to program, you found out about us, because like, where else were you going to do that? So we had, what's so important in these things, we had a community. And, within our community, and, and we also had like, we had like a kid named Dan Franzblau, who I think was either going off to MIT or just come from MIT. It's worth pointing out that the community of people who hung out there were pretty extraordinary. I think, we mentioned the fact that we wrote Paint and had Superboots software. What you call it, today we call them incubators, right? Everybody knows Y Combinator, there's a bunch of people sitting around, they kick out software, and there's a demo day. This is effectively what we had. The Capitol Children's Museum was in a former convent and hospital, so there was plenty of space. And upstairs, we set up a bunch of computers and people would sit there and start creating things. We actually were incubating Ted Nelson. So Project Xanadu, which has been going on forever, will go on forever and may eventually happen. So Ted was there, and like every night we'd hang out with Ted, and Ted would tell stories about, front ends and back ends, and how information has to be connected. And Ted is great. And then we had a couple of his programmers there. So there was this rich group of people who were incubating, precursors of hypermedia and AI and interactive computing. So we had this community. And out of that, there was this kid who was writing the front end and the back end of this kind of stuff. And another kind of interesting foundational point in this 1983 exhibit, in addition to kind of like doing that, if you did an interactive exhibit then, we realized that we wanted to build exhibits that were interactive. So we wanted to distribute some of the Atari computers, kind of turn them back into things that look more like, they physically had the shape of an Atari gaming thing you'd see in a bar. They were, would be solid and you could bang on them because we had kids. So we built a bunch of those. Ann mentioned some. One was you had to put a satellite in geosynchronous orbits. We wrote a simple program where you launch a satellite and you have to get the trajectory just right, because if it's not in a geosynchronous orbit, you're constantly turning these two paddles to try to keep up with the thing, right? And that's a loser. If it's in geosynchronous orbit, you win the game. So that was like, we would build those and deploy them, did a bunch of those. We wanted to have audio throughout the whole exhibit. And it turns out that the National Air and Space Museum, which had audio throughout it, right? You push a button, you listen to something. The old-fashioned way of doing that was like you had a lot of tape recorders. The Air and Space Museum adapted the passenger entertainment units of aircraft, which were digital audio, which was new at the time. So you'd have one coax cable running down the airplane to these units, and then the coax would resolve into 4 or 5 audio channels, which at the time was completely amazing. I mean, today, everything is that. And so we had like a control room with all the tapes, and we distributed the stuff. That's what drove the Cave and everything else. So we started with Cave. As Ann pointed out, we then wanted to move on to scriptorium and writing. There was a printing press. Between the 2 floors, we created a Tower of Babel, and we have the tapes of those somewhere, which talked about multiple languages and stuff. We wanted to do a TV studio. We wanted to give people the experience of creating TV or creating radio and seeing where that came from. Like the whole Montessori, or I do, what was Ann's line? I do and I understand. I see, I hear. Anyway, whatever it was. The point was you learn by doing, right? There was a TV studio. We need to get the TV studio donated. And the question, how are we going to do that? One of the things that the museum had going for it is it was just the beginning of corporate culture in Washington, D.C. And we were friendly with Al Gore. And we realized that if we threw an event to honor the House and Senate communications committees, and they were considering significant communications legislation overhaul at the time, if we threw an event to honor them, and then all the corporate lobbyists would pay to come to the event, we could be a kind of a neutral place where the communications lobbying aristocracy could hang out with the communications policymakers. It would make us look good, and we could throw a fundraiser and make money in the whole thing. So we started to kind of like, essentially figuring out how could we show to corporate America that we were a place where our policymakers understood the future because they could play with this stuff. And so eventually Sony, which had compulsory licensing, do you remember compulsory licensing? Early in the era of VCRs, the motion picture industry wanted a fee for every tape sold that could go to rights holders, so that if people ripped off videos, they'd still get paid. And the industry's like, no, that's ridiculous. We're selling a platform, we're selling tape, we're not going to pay content fees on that. So I think Sony gave us a giant TV studio, and I testified in Capitol Hill that we could not have people pay for each stuff, because then that would kill the education business. So there's a lot of that went on. When early on, I think Apple eventually became a big supporter, but They only, I think, got into it after Future Center and Atari were a success. Apple basically initially was not interested, but we had gotten a hold of either Ted Kahn or Linda Gordon, and Atari immediately got it because I think Atari had a much more active educational computing. They cared more about childhood development. That built a great relationship. And, that involved kind of a number of trips to them, but then they literally donated one day, probably 20 Atari 800 show up. And this is well before we'd gotten around to sorting out the software and what to do with them. And I remember it was very funny because they all showed up. I think we stuck them in the accountant's office. And she said, I'm so excited. We're going to computerize everything tomorrow. And I'm thinking, lady, this thing runs BASIC and you don't know how to program. You're probably not going to computerize everything tomorrow. But we were all optimistic back then. Right. Then eventually we set up Future Center, which meant we wrote a curriculum. We were teaching BASIC. We were teaching like designing stuff with sprites. I think at some point we created a rudimentary network so that when people turned things on, we knew how they worked. Along the lines of this whole bit about it's good to influence people, one day after Future Center was up and the exhibit was in good shape, it was a Sunday, Atari sent one of their senior consultants out to look into us. Were we influential? Was it any good? I guess there's another funding round coming up. So I was up that Sunday and I heard that morning as I was getting ready to meet the Atari guy that the Chief Justice of the United States, Warren Burger, was coming. And so I was shuttling between showing the Atari guy around and sticking him in Future Center and meeting the Chief Justice. I knew the solution here was the two of them would run into each other in the computer exhibit in front of the Atari thing. So I go back and forth, and then I usher the Chief Justice into the Atari computer room. And then now I walk into it with the guy from Atari, and I turn to him and I go, oh, do you know the Chief Justice of the United States and Mrs. Berger? And then Berger just goes on and on about how great this Atari thing is, and the computer center is. But there were things like that. So when you ask what the task was, it was both the conceptual task of how do you tell the story, how do you build stuff that's kid-proof, and then how do you create an opportunity in Washington to fund the whole thing?
Wow. Yeah, you mentioned the computer showing up. That sounds exciting. The numbers I've seen, all the articles I read said there were 30 Ataris. Ann thought there was 50. Like, okay, she might be right, or it might be whatever. It was a long time ago. But she also said about the 100 Apple computers, which I haven't seen listed anywhere.
If the Apple computers happened, it was after my time, because I was completely aware that during my era, Apple was pretty standoffish, like we could never figure out how to crack that. And Atari was gracious and welcoming. But in listening to the tape with Ann, I think she referred to the fact that the Apple stuff might have been later. And I left in 83 and went 81 and went to graduate school. Or 82.
So you use some of these computers in the exhibits. It sounds like you use some of them on the back end to run light shows and things, and then you had some of them in the lab.
Yeah, well, look, most of them were sitting in the lab because, say there was 30 computers, then 20 were in the lab, right? The point is there were a lot of computers in the lab, and the lab, the lab served whatever classes that we were doing. And then there were, maybe 8 or 10 computers around which we wrote exhibits, and then a couple of running back end things. And then we had a few upstairs, because don't forget we were writing that paint program. So Atari, the Atari 400 and 800 had a pretty sophisticated sprite system where you could do real-time graphics. And so the people we had, led by a software guy named Guy Nouri.
Right. I talked to him, interviewed him recently.
Oh, good. What does he have to say? And how is he?
Well, he's great. He talked to me for more than an hour, and it was very interesting.
Yeah, right. So that team was doing very interesting. We were trying to do things like, could one computer generate an image and a second one could transform that? We're trying to push things as much as we could. So the computers were devoted to both teaching, being in exhibits, and software development. there's another interesting piece of courseware. I think Ann mentioned to you this class that we taught members of Congress. Right. There was a particular purpose of that, which is interesting. So when we met with Al Gore, he said, you should teach a class to members of Congress about computers. And I said to him, sure, but you don't really care about bits and bauds and bytes. He goes, no, we don't care about that. But people will come onto us and say, look, Mr. Congressman, here's this report. The ozone layer is disappearing, and you have to make all these changes. And we're like, where did that come from? And he said, there's always this computer model underneath it. And you need to explain to us what those are and where they came from. So what we're really interested in is how computers model things and give us direction in the policy, which of course is exactly what the climate crisis is about, right? It's like got these models, and the Democrats are like, well, small changes lead to big outputs. We better get moving. And the Republicans are, I don't know anything about that. Steady as it goes. We'll deal with it later. Okay. When I was in college, and I studied computer modeling with Dennis and Dana Meadows, who were part of the Club of Rome group and did the population modeling, and they followed in the footsteps of Jay Forrester, who invented dynamic modeling, which were basically model a system, and you might have a number of rates and flows, like you have population, you have food, you have pollution, all these things, and then for each iteration you run through what happens, and it creates a prediction. That's what Al was after. So in putting together this course for members of Congress, we started with the realization they'd probably never used a computer. So the very first thing they did is we gave them effectively a coin toss game. You hit return, there's a coefficient in there, and they're either going to come up heads or tails. In this case, you hit return, you either got reelected or you didn't. And the reelection coefficient was about 0.2. So most of the time they lost, and they did not like this. And we said, if you don't like it, go in, we're going to show you basic, change the 0.2 to 0.8. It's going to be a lot more fun. Right. So that was the first thing. The second thing we did is we reduced the entire, I think these were like 8K computers. So we reduced the entire federal budget to maybe 16 or 20 lines, so, and the federal budget did not balance. And so we showed this to them. It was the same bottom line numbers. It's just not a lot of line items. And we said that the federal budget does not balance. And they're like, we know that. And they go, you now have 5 minutes to balance the budget. And they're like, we can't do that. We're Congress. And I say, you now have 2 minutes to balance the budget. And if you don't, I'm just going to wipe out defense and there'll be a surplus. And you can't do that. So we put them through this little exercise, and literally they're all sitting around messing with the budget.
In a spreadsheet.
In a spreadsheet. Yeah. What was it called? It wasn't VisiCalc. It was, there was an Atari, there was a spreadsheet built for the Atari 400 and 800.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And you couldn't fit a whole lot of cells in it. And in any event, we didn't want to confuse them. So we basically reduced it to about, 20 lines. And so they basically, you can go in and type the numbers and balance it, and we turn it into a game. Do you remember there was Chris Crawford wrote a program called Scram? It was a nuclear reactor simulator.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So 3 Mile Island happened in 79. Now it's like 81 or 82. The nuclear shit's on people's minds. So then everybody had to play Scram, at which point it turns out it's difficult to keep it from melting down. It's probably the closest members of Congress came to understanding how you engineer those things. Then we built up to a dynamic model. We wanted to build a dynamic long-term model, and Congress was debating Social Security legislation. And the problem with Social Security was, as the population got older, more people would need it than would pay in. And what do you do about that? And so we had programmed this thing. And so if it was 81, it would just play out every year from 81 to, 2050, when like all the boomers got old. And basically it turns out that's a really tough one, because for reasons we'll soon hear. So we go in and we show it to the members of Congress. And of course, what happens is it overshoots and collapses. People pay in, money goes in, but then money goes out, and you run out of money, and you need people who need it. We show this to Congress and we go, we have a few minutes to fix this. What do we do? And the Democrats are like, well, it's very simple. You have to raise taxes. Everybody knows that. So we raise taxes, and that buys, 5 years. Then Republicans say, we told you all along, you have to pay the people out later. Retirement has to start later. So we started retirement later. And that bought a few years, but it still didn't work. And amazingly, they looked at each other and go, well, let's compromise. Let's just do both. That bought a little more time, but it still didn't work out. It crashed. And then they look up at us, they go, nothing works. What do we do? And I said, well, funny, we were up all night messing with this. The only thing we can think of is we get wage inflation ahead of price inflation, or we increase the birth rate. And they're like, that's not going to happen. I said, well, there's one other thing. You could just create a fund out of nowhere and then it will be fine. So we kind of, in this dynamic model, kind of work through everything. You saw both Democratic and Republican biases. And I think the net from the group was, it's a really good thing we're elected every 2 years because long-term thinking is a pain. But that was very memorable to me because, I keep thinking, if you gave members tools about the climate crisis, would they believe it, or would they just say fake news and mess with the assumptions? But and the other thing that we did is we got Lexis and Nexus to come in, so you could do searches on yourself, and that was great fun. Except one of the congressmen had been involved in scandals, probably something sexual or gay or whatever. And we didn't want him to search himself. It'd be very embarrassing. So everybody else got to search him what they wanted to. And of course, for him, we managed it so that he would keep within the guardrails. Yeah. So anyway, those are some of the uses we put all this stuff to.
Nice. How exciting. Neat. Let's see. So is there any chance that any of the software that was created for the museum still exists? The exhibits, other than Paint, which was commercial.
Yeah. Well, I discovered all the audio tapes the other day because there was a master reel of everything we ran through the audio tapes for all these exhibits. I have that. You're asking what happened to all those exhibits, which, if we go back to that era, I don't think we had hard drives, right? I think we were all floppies. Okay, so if the software existed, it wouldn't be on a network. It wouldn't be on a hard drive. It would be on a 5-inch floppy in a box.
Yep.
Yeah. So it would be on a 5-inch floppy in a box. So then the question is, who took home those 5-inch floppies? I don't have them. They might be somewhere in Washington. Ann would know better what the history of that was. Is it possible that someone took something home? It's that form of archaeology. The one thing we don't, but it would be in a box, right? Because it could not possibly be on a network anywhere.
It could possibly be on a hard drive, but I mean, if someone had a Corvus drive or something, but not likely.
Yeah. I mean, and it's possible that somebody hooked a core drive up to a network, but it's also, I think we took some really good slides of it. This is almost part of a bigger question, which is what documentation exists so you can get inside of what we did. And I have like this concept document here. I think somewhere there's slides here. But there was a lot of richness to the exhibit, right? There was the telecom exhibit, which had, traditional cable and fiber optic cable and demos of how fiber optic cable worked. The TV exhibit, I think we did a chroma key thing, which was very advanced to do back then. Today, we always do green screens, but it was pretty magic for kids back then. There was a lot of richness to this stuff. And I don't know how much documentation exists. And for the programs, I don't know who would have a box of that stuff. I don't know. Paul Pangaro did a lot of the programming of our demo to Congress. But would he have a disc that's 30 years old? I don't know.
So what's on this audio tape that you found? Is it just like the sounds of a prehistoric cave, or what would you get?
No, there were the cave sounds. There was the Tower of Babel. There was something on the evolution of radio. It kind of starts maybe in the 1930s, and you hear the Orson Welles Panic broadcast, and you hear World War II in news, and then it moves you through into a medium of formats where radio becomes much more like it's rock or it's adult-oriented music or All Things Considered. It was kind of edited like that. There was the Hall of Misinformation. I was looking for that, but I didn't find it for today. But it was basically the audio that went with all the exhibits. Some of it was a little hokey. But it was the audio that accompanied the Tower of Babel, the cave. Any of the times you pick up telephones and there were descriptions of things, that kind of stuff.
Neat. You should digitize that using that beautiful reel-to-reel you've got. That's
Well, I did. I
cool.
actually did. And I
Uh-huh.
think I ran it from the reel to that Mac Pro and then brought it out to the Dropbox network. And so it's sitting here somewhere. But probably easier for me to get it afterwards as opposed to stop everything now going and
No.
searching.
Afterwards,
Yeah.
that'd be great. And if I can share it,
Yeah, I'll dig it up.
Great. Yeah,
It is that definitely exists, and it's definitely in this room somewhere.
It sounds like fun. Send me the Dropbox link. That sounds like a lot of fun. All right. So we talked briefly about your business plan for Superboots, which sounds like you wrote it after the fact for school, right?
Yeah. So we built the paint program, and Atari loved it so much they published it, right? And then the question that Ann had was, so the question was, could we build an educational software company? Because this was just at the beginning of the educational software music. Educational software before this, I think that CDC had some time sharing based educational software. And then as microcomputers came out, it was mostly games. And then there were a bunch of early people that could see the educational potential. And so that's where this came from. And I think there was one significant moment when we realized this stuff. There was one day we had some learning disability people come in, and they started playing with the computers, and they fell in love because the computers had infinite patience. And their experience with teachers is everybody got frustrated with them. And so it was frustrating. Whereas the computer could care less. It just kept with you. And watching these kids be incredibly happy and deeply fall into it made a very deep impression. It was like, this is clearly a good learning companion because it's infinitely patient and you can play with it and learn on your own. So when I went off to business school, I then, with my friend David Penzias, who was Nobel Prize winner Arno Penzias' son, we had to write a plan for something. So we wrote this Superboots plan, which I happened to find, right? So it's a classic business plan: product description, paint, packaging, product reviews, market analysis, hardware sales, market behavior, software entry strategy, sales force, acquisition of program and talent, royalties, located at the Children's Museum, capital equipment, manufacturing, management team, risks. Yeah, so the concept here was, could we build a company, that could do in the tens of thousands of units of sales, and then we talked about all sorts of different types of music education things and educational games, doing a book on all of this. So it was speculating. I haven't actually read this. I just pulled it out today. But it would be fun to look at because this was sitting here in 81, speculating what would happen in the computer market. After I got out of after I left the museum, I went to Wharton, got an MBA. And then immediately after that, I went off to Apple. I was at Apple for 9 years. So this experience clearly is what got me steeped enough in microcomputers that it was pretty easy for Apple to pick me up. But even when I arrived at Apple now in 1984,
what were you working on there? Apple II or Mac or Lisa?
Apple II. It was Apple II. The Mac division interviewed me, but the Apple II division hired me. And interestingly, the first assignment they gave me was home banking. Modem home banking in 1984, which was the thing. It's interesting to think that modems were becoming a consumer device in 84. Don't forget, the internet doesn't even go consumer till about 93, 94. So there was 10 years of, this is the 10 years that AOL and everything rose. And I said to the guys at Apple when I moved out here to California, why am I in charge of home banking? And they said, well, you're from the East Coast and you can wear a suit. So I'd gone to Wharton and I knew about computers. So that was my very first assignment at Apple. So here's an interesting thing. Even as we wrote the Superboot business plan, there were a lot of questions about how big this market would be, how risky it was. And when I went off to Apple, I remember, like, I'm in a hotel. It's like the first week there, I haven't found an apartment yet. And the New York Times comes out with this piece called Finding Home Computer Uses. And the net of it was, this whole home computer thing may be a fad. Some people put recipes on it, but that's silly. Everybody does gaming, but you can buy games. And okay, and then you could learn to compute, but that's about it, right? So there was a hypothesis that this was just like a fad, like everyone wouldn't need one. And I remember being very nervous, like, oh my God, I made a terrible decision. This computing thing is ridiculous. And so it was into that ferment that we wrote this business plan. I never went off and did that, because I went off and I went to work for Apple. I think the museum, look, nonprofit organizations always aspire to have as high an earned income line item as possible, right? You don't want to always have to raise money through donations or grants or government support. You want to have admissions and education and product. And so it was clear that, it was the nature of software that if you built it, it just kept on delivering without a lot of fixed cost. And so very early on, we figured out that was a good idea. But I don't think there was ever a team that stuck around that developed a deeper software business there.
Yeah. I mean, the plan, I read several articles that said the plan was Superboots was going to create all sorts of educational software. And the reality is Paint came out and Paint was great, but that was it. So,
well, we should future products cannot be fully developed in Superville's capitalists. Projects under consideration include Build It. Children design and modify three-dimensional structures. Build It will be designed with the assistance of Buckminster Fuller, one of the 20th century's great design innovators and a friend of the Capitol Children's Museum. I didn't realize I was familiar with Buckminster Fuller. I must have been. That's cool.
I'm going to program a geodesic dome on my Atari.
Build It is a children's introduction to architecture, an electronic answer to Tinker Toys, which is what Autodesk is doing today with Tinkercad. Animation Machine will be developed as a natural extension to Paint. Whereas Paint allows users to design an intricate still image, the animation package will create movies. Users will create picture elements using Paint and then direct action with the animation machine. Well, that's basically Macromedia Director, right? Superboots' Big Book of Communications. In 1982, the museum opened a major permanent wing on the history of communications. The exhibit has been called a guided tour of the information age, from cave to satellites and computers. Many microcomputers were created for communications, and all have become favorites with museum visitors. Okay, so now we're going to find out what they are. They include Morse code, in which visitors can type messages in English and see them translated into code. I remember that one. Or tap a message in code and read it in English. And Orbit, where children launch a communication satellite into geosynchronous orbit and then align Earth stations to send messages. Communications project consists of several programs. These represent several project concepts Superboots is consumed. And now I think the rest of it then goes on with how do you get talent and how do you enter the market and what are the costs, right? So like here in the budget, development computer system, 2 Atari 1200 with floppy disks and printers, 2 IBM personal computers, 2 Apple IIe computers, and 2 Commodore 64. So clearly we were trying to write something for multiple environments. Development software, utilities, cross assemblers, and other development software for use on the PDP 1170 computer. I think Ann mentioned DEC gave us it ran the DEC operating system, which we didn't want. We wanted Unix, which was not licensed then, but we knew it was the right system. We had all this communications. I still have a book here with all of our communications. Bell Labs refused to let us use Unix. Office renovation and office equipment futures, $100,000. Doesn't even have a line item for people. Product development schedules. So, how long it takes to do these things. Management team. There's Ann, there's a software development lead. There's a marketing lead. And then there's risks. There are risks. Consumer software products behave similarly to popular books and records. Some are hits, some are not. It's difficult to predict how consumers will react to new offerings. Cost overruns and development delays, competitive pressures. Competition is our greatest challenge. Only those publishers who have access to retail shelf space and good relationship with distributors and name recognition for their products will survive. Smaller firms will get absorbed. Okay, and it goes on from there. And then we have some article by me in Instructional Innovator magazine explaining about Future Center on our curriculum.
Computats and other joys of museum life.
Yes, that's it. Right. Oh, and here is that New York Times article, Finding Home Computer Uses by Andrew Pollack. Video games at 51%, homework at 46, learning tools at 46, adult learning at 42. And then it starts off that it starts off with the possible disappointment in this market. Greg Berger, a concrete salesman from Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey, purchases a home computer that he uses to keep track of his investments and to learn about computers. While he's happy with the purchase, he said, quote, "I'm somewhat disappointed there's not more uses for it." It goes downhill from there. Profile of the computer buyer. Right. This was an era of great doubt about how this market would develop. These graphs, by the way, there was some very cool Casio device where you typed in numbers and it printed out little graphs. Here's educational software revenues. Oh, here's educational software revenues 1982. And TI, Radio Shack, Atari, and Apple were in the lead. Then Educare, Krell, Spinnaker, BrainBank, Muse, all these old names back in the day. Then there's a per chart, an org chart, financial statements, Superboots.
Nice. How durable were all these machines that were getting used all the time in the lab?
Yeah, so this is great. Well, first of all, there were two things we did. When you came in and you used the computer, you were relatively respectful because, like, there was a teacher, you were being supervised, and you typed. But imagine out on the exhibit floor, you're banging away at things. Also, you're not even reverent. You're like a 3-year-old doing this, right? Fortunately, in addition to the Atari computers, we had a relationship with the Atari, the company that made game machines for public use.
Mm-hmm.
And they really know how to build something battle-proof. Like the joysticks and the buttons survived anything. So Atari sent us a whole bunch of those, and we basically fashioned all of the stuff that you use publicly off of joysticks, potentiometers, buttons.
So using arcade cabinet parts.
We used arcade cabinet parts, and that was pretty good. And from what we could tell, there was like a consumer spec, a mil spec, and then a kid spec. And in the military, they weren't trying to destroy it, but kids had no idea. Yeah, so we had a lot of arcade parts. I don't remember a lot of problems with the I think the computers held up. I mean, those Atari computers were, they were built for kids, right? So they actually, held up pretty decently.
Cool.
What I don't see, I don't know if Ann has this, is our curricula, the different courses and stuff, right?
Oh.
Because do you have that?
No, tell me.
Yeah. I mean, I imagine there was a creative course that used paint. There was clearly there was a basic, kind of class. I don't know if we also taught classes in like how to use spreadsheets. I mean, I imagine those are the kinds of things we would have done.
So do you have this curriculum guide or not anymore?
I don't see it. I mean, the one that I'm most familiar with is the one I'm most familiar with was the course we taught to members of Congress, because it was so prescient. Like, Gore was right onto the fact that computer models would be what drives the future. And it was so correct that dynamic models where small inputs bring big outputs, Democrats love because they like change, and Republicans hate these. And that essentially set up the climate debate and everything we've seen since. Like, you could just see it being seeded back then. Although what we were doing was sufficiently fun and innocent that like everybody was agreeing and playing together. I couldn't imagine that happening today.
Yeah. Huh. Something you said in this article I thought was interesting. You just had a phrase that one of your main jobs was to introduce an uninitiated public to computer technology. in the interviews I've done and just kind of my estimation, getting kids interested in computers, I think, was super easy. They were drawn to it. It was fun. And then the adults were scared, were more nervous about it. Did you find that to be the case, or how did you introduce an uninitiated public to computer technology?
Right. Part of what we were trying to do with that whole exhibit was tell the story of the coming information age. That was, Mark Porat was one of our advisors, and Mark, who later went on to create General Magic, had written the seminal report for the Department of Commerce that pointed out that America had gone from agricultural to an industrial era, and now we were transitioning to an information era. That's where most of the revenue and growth in the economy would come from. And that was the story we wanted to tell. So like computing was a piece of a bigger story of the coming information age. And that's, we'd spent a lot of time at Xerox. Xerox was developing, they wanted there'd be Ethernet everywhere. That's why Sony was in it. We had a lot of support from the cable TV industry. Tom Wheeler, who ran the Cable Association, got Scientific Atlanta to donate a giant Earth station. And then we got the cable operators to let us do all their channels. We had a huge cable head end, right? So what we really wanted to do was introduce people to this whole world of telecommunications and how rapidly it was going. As a museum exhibit, it worked great. One of the secrets about a museum is that most museums have the same demographic. So at the same time that we were doing ours, Gordon and Gwen Bell, Gwen especially, were doing the digital museum in Marlborough, Mass. And originally, Gwen was standoffish. She said, look, Peter, we're doing a serious museum for serious people, and you're doing just a kids museum. What we both learned is it's the same audience. At the DEC Museum in Massachusetts, parents on a Sunday would drag their kids in. At the Children's Museum, kids would drag their parents in. But at the end of the day, kids and parents were spending a couple of hours staring at computers and figuring out what was going on. And of course, the beauty part was the kids were explaining it to the parents and all that stuff. So the phenomenon in museums that work is there's a fair amount of wonder and playfulness. People are pretty open-minded. And, we were stepping people through because they were beginning to get a sense of the utility of this, right? Oh, I'm fiddling with a communication satellite. Look, I can type in English and it comes out as Morse code. I think in addition to Future Center, there was an Atari exhibit. There was an exhibit of this is the computer age. And part of what we were trying to show was massive increases in the speed of computing. From Gordon and Gwen through the Computer Museum, we got a register bit slice from either Whirlwind or ENIAC, the first vacuum tube computer, right? And then we mocked up in black and white big pictures of ENIAC. So when you entered the Atari exhibit, you were confronted with a 1950s era vacuum tube computer that had a real piece in it and the rest was whatever, right? And then you went through something that talked about changes in memory, right? So earlier on, you'd come in, there was an exhibit on Kipu, like we stored memory in the scriptorium and on rope. And so we've been all along talking about how do you store memory. Suddenly now we have digital memory, and then you see memory stored in a vacuum tube, and I forget what other we had.
Core memory and whatever, yeah.
Right, exactly. And now you're in front of a bunch of Ataris that and the point was, look how far this has come. So it was things like that I think that explain the scale of computing pretty well. The uninitiated bit, this stuff was new back then, and people didn't know the uses. This is a constant thing when new technology comes out. Like in that little article I read, that guy in New Jersey buys a computer, like, well, now what do I do with it, right? And when blocking came out, people were like, well, what would I say? I remember when YouTube came out, people were confounded. It's like, what would I stick up there, right? So, and when personal computing came out, it's like, now what? And people were silly about this before they figured out the uses. I mentioned the accountant at the museum and these 25, 30 computers show up and now everything will be computerized. Well, you kind of missed the bit. You needed the right software, the right entry stuff, the right processes, right? Because it's the computer. So no one quite very much understood. And the same thing when the internet came out. What would I say? So, in that, I think, and that's the reason that Atari wanted to support us, right? We were going to show, not only in DC, but to members of Congress, this broader communication story. I think in the computer center, my guess is most of the actual introduction and learning was done by kids who had the patience and parents had the aspirations for them. I think we were also doing after school stuff, or we were doing stuff for people who were young working people looking to improve. I mean, my guess was, we were in Northeast Washington, which was a pretty much of an African-American community. And we reached out very much into a community that would not have access to anything. And the rest of our community had access to stuff, but didn't know where they needed it yet. So it was kind of an interesting moment there. So did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
We touched briefly on the DEC system that Ann said it was a complete disaster setting up the KidNet messaging system. Do you have any thoughts or memories about that?
Yeah, it arrived with whatever the operating system was.
VMS.
Yeah, so I guess it arrived with Fax VMS. And there weren't a lot of people who knew how to do much doing that. I think we wanted Unix, both because it was more open, and I thought I think the thinking was we could program a real-time network environment better in that. Look, I think building what's essentially a real-time, today we'd call it a social network, right? But essentially a real-time messaging system and the ability to call up and share activities, that's a pretty sophisticated software project. And I don't think they ever fielded a team to do it. And my guess is we probably never had a line system architect that actually knew what to do. The reason that Superboots works or that Paint works so well is we had an incredibly gifted team. It was unusual, right? Because the Atari stuff, not that many people knew how to operate the sprites and what to go do. We had a gifted team that was able to write very low level into Atari, and also had a really good sense of what they wanted to do that was fun. And so you had that right combination of a developer and a designer and somebody who get under the hood and talk low level. And so we ended up with an unexpectedly good program. Yeah, I think that talent to go build a real-time system required, it was a different set of talent, and we did not, they never got that. Yeah, so there was a big, also, I don't think DEC, there just also was not that stuff on, I don't think there was that much stuff on VMS that was that broadly relevant to people. You kind of had to go do it yourself.
Yeah. What haven't I asked you about that time that I should have?
There was an enormous amount of energy over what this new era would look like as a form of media and possibly in the arts. I wrote a piece for the Washington Journalism Review around then that talked about how what we were seeing in computer games would soon become a new form of art. Well, look at last week and NFTs, and we see that. But there was a real sense that the nature of media and expression was transforming. I remember around that time, I mean, because you could see, you could begin to see that people who were kind of like artistic and thoughtful were just creating completely new things, right? And this was also, very early. This was early in a lot of the computer graphics and CGraph stuff, and I think we showed a lot of that stuff at the museum, right? We were very. Oh, did Ann tell you about Harold Cohn?
I don't think so.
Okay, so this is really cool. Harold Cohn was a computer artist, and in the 1960s, he was a well-known colorist. I mean, he was a beautiful guy. He was in the Tate, and then he dropped out. He became bored. And in the 70s, he started teaching himself expert systems, early artificial intelligence. And expert systems are one where you try to model a system and you procedurally write the whole thing out, as opposed to today's neural networks where you aim it at something and then in a black box fashion, it comes up with a model of it and humans barely understand it. Harold, for over a decade, would analyze his aesthetics and then write a program that would approximate his aesthetics, right? This started with Sol LeWitt, who would program a computer to make something, but he would write instructions for it to make a piece of art. Harold wanted to write a generalized set of instructions that understood his aesthetics, and then the computer could generate art. And he did a piece for us in 81. His program was called Aaron. And the early version of the program, and we met him through DEC. It actually ran on VAX. And in early versions, it was black and white, and it was not figurative, but it kind of understood, like, foreground and background. So it might look like a boulder and it might look like trees. And it would execute on a Tektronix printer. And if it violated itself, it would like poof and start over again. Harold came down and projected onto our wall. And then he goes on scaffolding, he painted by hand a beautiful mural, wonderful color mural, which was his piece of computer art projected, but it was an expert system that was his art.
So he painted a picture that was developed by a computer emulating his own style.
Well, here's the thing. The computer was only black and white. So it projected the outlines, and then he came through and did his beautiful colors.
Okay.
Right. So that's because the computer was only sophisticated enough to be black and white. 10 years later, in the 90s, he auctioned a piece of the Computer History Museum. And at this point, he had developed a printer that used like 9 or 12 watercolors. So it was a giant watercolor printer that actually used brushes, and then he could program like how much it would mush down so you get different brush qualities. And it was figurative by then. So it was a beautiful picture. But that was an example of our curiosity that this was the beginning to be a new form of media, a new form of communication, right? And so that was this article that I had written about computer art. And I remember at that time, a friend of my mom was a woman named Holly Solomon, who was a very well-known art gallerist in New York, and she was supposed to be very avant-garde. And during this exhibit, I was home for Thanksgiving. And I said to Holly, look at all this stuff going on with Atari and graphics. This is soon to be a new form of art. And she's like, you're an idiot, kid. No, that's not art. That's just a bunch of mechanical stuff. And I'm like, no, you brought photography to the fore. And she goes, you don't know what you're talking about. To this day, I run an art and technology center that deals with the emerging forms of art in communication and computing here, called Gray Area, which we can talk about. But the long answer to your question, what did we leave out, is we were at the dawn of new forms of expression and of art. And you could see people who were coders, but were also artists, expressing themselves in new ways. And I think that was a lot of the excitement. I think that was one of the reasons we were doing, art programs and things like that. And that also picks up, the Ted Nelson portion of it. There was an advanced research or incubation bit here that we often leave out, which was upstairs in the attic where there was plenty of space. That's where Harold Cohn would hang out. That's where Ted Nelson would hold court with his team writing whatever they were writing. Paul Pangaro, who got deep into AI, I think was the guy who actually wrote our dynamic model for teaching members of Congress. And that was, that was an well before we had the term incubator. That was an incubator really trying to do kind of what the Media Lab type things, but in our own way.
All right, good answer. So yeah, what do you do these days? Tell me about those projects.
I was at Apple for 9 years and then went on and kind of did a series of software companies. I did one that we sold to Macromedia that later became Adobe, that was basically a rapid development programming environment for basically back-end web applications. So early on in the web, there were plenty of front-end tools where you design something, you'd write HTML. We did one of the first ones that kicked out server-side code. So you could do record sets and you could do shopping carts and kind of all of that stuff. Later, I was chairman of Technorati. It was the first search engine for social media. So kind of each of these career steps was like you had to explain to people what was new. Our exhibit was, the museum was explaining this to people. When I was at Apple, I led a lot of the efforts to get us into networking communications. I mean, the whole home banking thing was explaining to both banks and to consumers what this stuff was. I led a lot of our early information service stuff, which was both local area networks and connectivity to mainframes and stuff. You had to explain to everybody what was going on. In the early days of social media, people had no idea what was going on. I did a project for the United Nations a couple of years ago on called Global Pulse, and it was basically the use of artificial intelligence, advanced analytics, and Internet of Things to find slow-moving crises around the world. So essentially, advertisers, as we now know, are able to use technology that are able to very much predict who will purchase something. Advertisers are very good at targeting. We weren't particularly good at targeting where relief aid or where would economic problems come. So this was a project we did for the UN where we showed examples of how to go do that. About 10 years ago, we started something in San Francisco called Gray Area, which is an art and technology center. And here we teach some of the most advanced, capacities in coding and in art. So processing and Arduino and wearable soft circuits. A lot of the research that we do is around things like coded bias and kind of the equity issues around art and technology. We've done a lot of work in immersive place-based media. So, there's an isolating component to kind of AR and VR, but if you're in place and you're immersed in stuff and that stuff helps interpret things. So it's a very rich art and technology center here, also with a great community. And then my interests, I've always been interested in kind of the expanding platform of this. So I did a book a couple years ago called The Maker City. If the whole conceit of the museum was we want kids to do things and try things, the maker movement was very much a similar kind of thing, right? And Dale, who started the maker movement, and I did a book, and we started asking if people were involved in the co-creation of their cities, in the design of their cities, there'd be more agency, there'd be more engagement, there'd probably be less crime. And what you had would be more convivial and lively than just kind of boring downtowns. And this was based on a lot of experimental stuff we did in San Francisco, where we actually changed some of the urban planning laws, and we had whole communities of citizens and artists create kind of like Burning Man, temporary things that could be part of the town that could then become permanent. So I did a book on that, and I've since become very much engaged in how do you go start building communities where there can be growth and economic growth, but without displacement, gentrification without displacement. So communities, rather than being thrown out, are participating in their co-creation of their growth. So we're involved in a very large fund, and we're doing projects at scale. I think this is a perfect time to build mixed-use communities that are post-COVID, that pick up our learning, but also understand how to be inclusive. So rather than communities getting into fights over what to develop, they're doing it together. So I'm putting a lot of time into that, putting a lot of time into a gray area where we're doing a fair amount of work. And there's another project called New World Fair, which is more of an exhibition-oriented thing, kind of goes back to the museum here. And I still invest in, I'm involved in software and startup companies here in Silicon Valley, because I've been out in basically since business school. I've been out in San Francisco and Silicon Valley.
Nice. If you could send a message to the kids who went to the museum and now they're adults, and maybe they have fond memories of visiting your museum, what would you tell them?
Gee, I'd be more interested in listening to hear what they have to say.
That's
right?
what Ann said. You can't say that same thing.
Yeah. If we were to talk to people who went through that, I mean, what's interesting is to reflect on how early that was. And I mean, another interesting thing is to reflect on the trajectory of our aspirations for technology and how it evolved. That era when we did this, which was, don't forget, right around the time Steve started Apple, and we just come off of the 60s. So there was a very naive but very positive, we can change the world and do good attitude, right? This is the coming off of the 1960s and the youth movement and change. Don't forget the whole homebrew computer thing was this sense of, we'll take control of microprocessors away from big companies and the man and the army, and we can do it ourselves. Changing the world was indistinguishable from doing good back then, right? It never occurred to us that if you propagated personal computers, you could possibly end up with where we are now, polarization, end of work, a coded bias, and things that reinforce racism. Like we have learned that the tech world has not only introduced a bunch of problems, but arguably is responsible for the most pressing new sets of problems that we have. And in that founding moment, we're not aware of that. Like, we understood bad programs could blow rockets up, but it never occurred to us that anything we were doing from a values point of view could screw things up. And then we became, I think, keenly aware of this around the millennium. So I would be kind of interested in how people's trajectories and realizations of that changed, because we were all the product of this very techno exuberant experimental moment. I mean, this is what Alan Kay was all about. These Dynabooks could do amazing things. Ted Nelson was completely about, when we liberate information and we have super distribution, everything's going to be wonderful, right? And that was the conceit of everything back then. So to me, what's interesting is how that shifted, and what are the sets of things we can do today to make sure that values and inclusive systems are built into what we're doing. And I would just be kind of, in talking to people since then, I would kind of be interested to hear how their trajectories moved along that axis.
That's a fascinating and thoughtful answer. Thank you. I think I have what I need. Thank you,
Yeah.
Peter.
Yeah.
This was great.
That was fun.